Let's talk through a few finer points for some sneaky forward operatives in Warhammer 40K, some tips, tricks, and things to avoid, and hopefully a few advantages to help them give you an edge in a game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Infiltrators, and in this video I thought we'd do a full overview of the powerful ability in Warhammer 40k, and a few ideas for using it to your advantage. Let's go through the basic rule and some of the things that make infiltrate units particularly handy to have around, a few ideas for putting them down on the board, and some other options that you might be able to use depending on the opponent's army. First up, let's start with the rule itself in 10th edition. Infiltrators is a datasheet ability, and the majority of factions in the game have access to at least one unit that can do it. Even some of the ones that normally can't, like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights, can still access the rule via allies or agents. Units with this rule during deployment can set up anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from both enemy units and the enemy deployment zone. So rather than having to stay within your own deployment zone, they can set up anywhere in the midboard, giving you a whole bunch of advantages between screening, early damage dealing, board control, and objective things. Most of your units tend to get locked to being within your own deployment zone, usually meaning that they're not in the best position to take the midfield objectives or take the fight to the enemy and deal damage turn 1. So it is quite a powerful ability, but in 10th edition Games Workshop do seem to have been extra careful with it. For things that have it naturally on their datasheet, they tend to be kind of low threat and lightly armoured units, maybe good for destroying enemy lighter infantry, though don't tend to be great for killing anything bigger. There are a few interesting power combos that you can get infiltrators on, often with a few funky enhancements or detachment rules. Being able to deploy closer to the enemy though definitely has its positives and negatives, and while you can definitely gain some big advantages with it, there's definitely ways in which your infiltrators could basically fall flat a bit, not really help you out much, and maybe even help your opponent. As mentioned, most factions in the game now have access to some kind of infiltrate style units, and ideally if you're given the choice of multiple different infiltrators, often the ones that are the cheapest and lowest investment to put on the board tend to be the most played, though obviously it does depend a bit on their actual unit efficiency. The reason that cheap ones tend to be most valuable is their primary value is just being a unit to be in that position on the board, regardless of what the unit actually does. If they do happen to deal damage or have some funky other special rules of one sort or another, then all well and good. But the biggest value that you're getting out of them is literally having a unit to start and screen the enemy, take objectives, and potentially doing other annoying things like move blocking. And that has loads of value just in itself, even if they don't do really any damage at all. Often if there's the choice, you might want multiple small units as opposed to one big unit that can deal lots of damage. It doesn't mean that big squads of infiltrators can't be worth it, such as Orc Commandos, which are locked to a 10 model squad and are kind of expensive in points, but usually given the choice, if people are fielding small units of infiltrators for their normal style roles, they'll usually field them in as small units as possible. Things like 5 Space Marine Scouts or 5 Drukhari Mandrakes. Cheap units that can get a lot of the same value without having to overinvest into massive units. So certainly say that one potential list building mistake is not to build your infiltrate units bigger than they really need to be. Far better to take multiple small units that can be in various different places on the board rather than one big one. Otherwise, for all important datasheet things, I feel like actually their durability and toughness might be one of their most important stats. Certainly doesn't hurt if they can deal damage, but often they're going to be on the very front line of the enemy army. If they can be as irritating to kill as possible, then that's generally going to be a good thing to soak up more fire, or just force the opponent to commit far more resources to them than they really want to. If occasionally an infiltrating unit can cling to life on a midfield objective unexpectedly, the consequences can be quite big for victory points. When adding infiltrators to an army list, for most armies out there, unless you're trying to do some sort of super clever big ball control type things, I'd probably not try and overinvest in them. I'd argue that usually the more infiltrators that you have on the board, the more diminishing returns that you get. The first squad just being super valuable, particularly in certain matchups, and then after that each further squad will still have some value but probably add less than the first. Particularly as mentioned, infiltrator units tend to be costed for the advantage of their special rules, so don't tend to have absolutely stellar damage and defense. Even just having one unit in an army list means that you could screen out a good portion of the board against enemy armies, and that can be massive in certain games, though if your infiltrators that you've got access to are merely just kind of so usable but not super exciting, many armies might just choose to take one unit of infiltrators. Say maybe Adeptus Mechanicus, I've often seen them just running at one singular unit of their Sicarian infiltrators. Otherwise, just for common tournament builds, I feel like I've seen a lot of Space Marine lists that have taken exactly 2 units of 5 Space Marine Scouts, or exactly 2 units of 5 Drukhari Mandrakes. again having a fairly strong presence in the midboard that can do a lot of screening in the matchups that call for it, and both of those units I'd say are maybe a little bit more efficient and interesting, particularly with their abilities to redeploy around the board. I think the reason that people don't tend to go massively above that sort of level is, as mentioned, the infiltrator units not being crazily good for damage and defense, but also partly the whole first turn alpha strike type thing. If you say had an army that took absolutely loads of infiltrators, then it might mean that you have a very good or bad game, just literally depending on the first turn dice roll. Say you had 5 big threatening units of infiltrators in the midfield, it might mean that if you go first, then you get to do a whole bunch of damage to the enemy, or get your units into really great move blocking positions to stop the enemy going forward at all. But then if you get unlucky and you happen to be going second, then it might be that the enemy is actually in really good position to do the same to you, still able to advance into the midfield really quite well and maybe get a whole load of easy damage off against all your units that are far further forward than they normally be, and often going to be an absolutely optimal strike range for their army. On top of that, I feel like there's board control and positioning that has diminishing returns as well. If you went super heavy on infiltrators, you put the first unit down in the most valuable spot, then the second unit in the second most valuable spot, and then by the time you reach the third or fourth unit, you might just not have that many more valuable spots to drop, and you might be putting things in the open where they could be getting lit up really easily first turn, or just in the same sort of places as the units that you've already put down, not really giving you much board control advantage. I feel like maybe the Chaos Deceptors Alpha Legion style detachment could be a good example of that. You can have loads of stuff infiltrating if you want to. Could give you some fairly godly board control in the early game, but maybe risks a fair bit as to lots of their units getting destroyed early on if they go too aggressively and the opponent gets first turn, or having a bunch of their units shot down from deploying where they want to by a big squad of enemy infiltrators that sees the midfield first. In general, between all that, I just feel like it's a bit of a mistake to go super heavy on the infiltrators, and a lot of lists may be going somewhere between 1 and 3 units, depending on how good the ones that they have access to are. Moving on, let's talk properly about the advantages of infiltrate units, then I'll go through them individually on their own slides. I say perhaps the biggest two are screening and board control, and being able to give you advantages on objectives. For board control, you can basically stop enemy scouts and infiltrators getting where they want to be, or first turn teleport type units. They can support your army in allowing your scout moves to function well, and potentially move block or nuisance charge the enemy. For objectives, they can be useful both for primary objectives, putting some objective control down there early, and maybe helping out with the trading game there, and also be in the right position to do secondary objectives. And then a few more things that might be a bit more matchup or army dependent, things like whether or not you actually want to try and have them in a position where they could deal some alpha strike damage, whether or not you want to infiltrate them in the first place, and some armies have access to some really quite big threat infiltrate type units, or some fun redeploys that can both work well with them. Starting with the screening and board control, I feel like this is probably one of the single best reasons to have infiltrators in the list, or at least one unit of them. It means that if you don't have any infiltrators in the army, the enemy is going to be able to deploy their infiltrators and make their scout moves exactly where they like. So it could mean that you might be starting the game with multiple enemy units hiding out on objectives in the midfield, which isn't the best. Or if they've got some scary scout move threats like maybe World Eaters or Leagues of Votan, they might be able to get into position to line up big damage on your turn 1 completely unimpeded if you don't have a unit in the midfield to press them back a bit. Against the right army, the Scouts 1 can be really quite a big deal, particularly with things like the World Eaters, Lord Invocatus, Scout moving things like Exalted 8-bound around, and regular 8-bound get it base. Scouts have to keep at least 9 inches away from your models, so you could potentially keep important units in their deployment zone. You're certainly probably going to have the infiltration type units itself charged and killed, but that might be the lesser of two evils, if those scout move units might have been charging your front line in your own deployment zone turn 1. They can also be good for taking up a position on the board that the enemy might have wanted to put one of those big threat infiltrate units down that we'll get onto, and might be handy against certain units that have got first turn teleport type maneuvers that they can do, like orcs with da jump, and just be out in the middle of the board to be able to screen out deep strikers when they might be wanting to arrive turn 2. Otherwise, if you have your own big scary units with scout moves, then having infiltrators can guarantee that you can use those scout moves to get closer. Say for example, if you were Abmeg and the enemy had some infiltrators of their own, if you just had some Cerberus Raiders in the list, then the enemy might put their infiltrators into the midfield and stop them moving up. Whereas if you have your scouts behind an infiltrate unit in the midboard, then you guarantee that they should be able to be moving up in safety without getting screened. And that could be a lot more important for something that was a lot more big and threatening. Maybe say Dark Angels with their Black Knight Death Star that they can do in company of hunters, or Orc Squig Hog Boys in Da Big Hunt. Otherwise, besides board control things, objectives are perhaps one of the most important reasons to have infiltrators around. Often if you've got some infiltrators with some objective control, then setting up on a primary objective in the corner of a ruin or something hidden out of line of sight from the enemy is about as good real estate as the infiltrators can get. It means the opponent, if they want to take that point, will have to aggressively push at least something onto that midfield objective to stop you scoring it or trying to take it for themselves. It might be something melee where they could try and charge and destroy your infiltrators, which definitely could happen, or maybe they're just trying to muscle you off it with objective control and they haven't been able to draw line of sight or charge your units. But either way, hopefully it should be at least some fairly good news, as it means that whatever threat they've put there should hopefully be in a good place for you to try and counter-attack it with the rest of your army, ideally in a position where it's exposed and you can hit back hard. You can't score the primary objectives turn 1, but it does mean that when it comes to turn 2, that point should be on lockdown unless your opponent's done something about it. Just for a quick map representation, here for example you could have some Space Marine scouts that are just in range of that red objective marker on the left there, but they're hiding out of line of sight in one of those L-shaped ruins, so I feel like generally that's going to be quite a good place for some infiltrators to set up. Just taking a point and in the midfield, and the opponent needs to push forward to try and do something about them if they want to take that place. It means as well that if you wanted to have your army protected from enemy infiltrators doing annoying move block or first turn charge type things, you could safely set up the bulk of your forces around the big orange X in the bottom left hand corner. It means the opponent's just not going to have any space to scout move, first turn teleport, or place too many infiltrators near that position on the board, so it generally gives you a big position of strength to deploy your most important units. Then maybe if on turn 1 the opponent wants to move forward and take that point, they might be forced to push some damage dealers up. For example, here are some Tower Crisis suits that have jumped around the edge of the ruin to destroy your infiltration unit. They've moved in and maybe they've killed most of them. If you're lucky, perhaps 1 or 2 survive to still contest the objective, though perhaps not. But hopefully either way, the unit that's moved up to try and take that point has just exposed itself to a big amount of return enemy fire. And ideally you might have traded out well with losing a unit of cheapish infiltrators and trying to take something far more important. Back to objectives though, and the other major thing are secondary objectives. Having infiltrators deploy in the mid-board can be a huge deal for them as well, perhaps particularly for tactical secondaries where you don't know when you're going to get certain missions drawn. Say if you're going first and drew your tactical objectives and you got things like engage on all fronts or one that requires you to do actions in the mid-board, it's going to be a massive advantage to have units that are already there that can easily move to satisfy those secondary conditions, whereas otherwise you might just have been going a turn without scoring. Just having a few units up the board could change things from being unusable to fine round 1. Maybe Chaos Nurglings being a particularly good example of that in the Leviathan missions, though given the restrictions to what Objective Control 0 units can do, their use for that role is going to go down quite a lot, so it's going to be better off with infiltrators that are OC1 or more. For when you actually deploy the infiltrators, when you're looking to do so might depend on your opponent's army as well. You need to see whether or not they've got their own infiltrators or any important things that you really want to screen with yours. And if both armies have rival infiltrators that might well be vying for the good spots on the board, if you get first drop it might well be worth putting down a unit of infiltrators first and taking up the best real estate before the enemy manages to put their unit on it. You both have the value of taking up a good spot on the board and hopefully denying the opponent the ability to do the same, which is kind of big. Though otherwise, all other things being equal, they might be units that you put down a little bit later in the deployment sequence. It depends what other big important units that you've got to deploy in the unit minigame, but in theory, if you could drop the infiltrators towards the end of deployment, it could give them big advantages, maybe just absolutely making sure there's no way that the opponent can get line of sight or damage on them turn 1 if they're trying to hide, or potentially even putting themselves in a position where they're going to be kind of safe if the enemy goes first, but might still be in the position to deal some important damage or do some nuisance work if you happen to win the roll for first turn. If there's perhaps a super fragile and valuable enemy unit that they could perhaps line up to charge, then that could be big, particularly if they've got the opportunity to destroy something that's far more valuable than they are. Another interesting thing with deployment are redeploy abilities. This was perhaps one of the only major changes to Infiltrators type rules since 10th edition came out. In the designer's commentary, Games Workshop clarified that anything that allows you to redeploy units does allow you to use the Infiltrators ability when you do, which I had seen certain people in different tournaments ruling that in different ways before that. I feel like for choice of units that you can redeploy, Infiltrators do feel like they're one of the things that's high up the priority list that would be a good idea to. You might even have been able to do the screening where you stop enemy infiltrators going places that you don't want to, and then pull back your own infiltrators to somewhere that's safe, or just shuffle them around a bit if your opponent's put something that's a bit unexpected down, perhaps having something that can either destroy them in melee or get range on them turn 1, and you might be able just to move them a little bit subtly within a ruin so they're not going to be under threat turn 1. And there are some units out there that can get basically perfect knowledge redeploys on infiltrate type units, things like the Kroot Farstalkers and Trail Shaper, or the Space Marine Phobos Captain and Scouts and Phobos Marines, and they can be really quite interesting for the whole infiltrate style minigame. They get to redeploy units after you know who's going first, so you could potentially have things screen stuff out and then either hide if the opponent's going first, or go a bit more aggressive and maybe move block or deal a bit of damage turn 1 if you're going first. Anything with infiltrate and also the scout keyword can do this well too. Space Marine Scouts maybe being a particularly good example, when you can both forward deploy and then scout after you know who's got first turn. So they could just use that little bit of movement to get closer to the enemy or further into safety, depending on what makes sense. Otherwise, I feel like there's a few exceptions that maybe break the trends for infiltrate style units. Most of the time, they tend to be small, cheap, expendable units scrapping over midfield objectives. But a few armies have access to some really quite big, scary, and chunky infiltrate units. Maybe things like a full unit of Genestealer called Aberrants with a character with the enhancement, Space Marine Vanguard Spearhead with Calgar Aggressors and the Apothecary. That can put an absolutely devastating threat in the midfield, or 6 Wraiths and a Technomancer with the enhancement in the Canoptech Court for Necrons. The idea behind these guys is they just operate really quite differently. They're not really playing just for the objectives or anything like that, but more just putting one of these enormous threatening units right in the middle of the board, and the opponent having to be wary about approaching them just in case they move up towards their general direction, and then these big scary units just pop out and delete something that's far too important to the core of their army. For the Aberrants and the Aggressor Blob, they're really quite dangerous at close range and at least fairly tough to take out, at least with normal firepower given the sheer volume of them, so it can be hard units to handle, and the Canoptech Wraiths and Technomancer are definitely more in favour of durability over sheer damage, but still can have loads of value in being a big unit that can still delete some medium-sized enemy units, and then are just a massive pain for the enemy army to try and take down. Ideally for these things, I want to put them somewhere that's as safe as possible within the midfield, usually in a ruin where the entire enemy army isn't going to be able to draw line of sight to them where possible, but still in a position where they're threatening and scary enough that if the enemy moves forward at all, then they're going to be able to hit them back ridiculously hard. Finally, just to cycle through a few other things for more normal small squad infiltrator type things. First turn move blocks could sometimes be worth sacrificing a unit for, say for example some Necron flayed ones blocking the path of a bunch of Imperial Knights between some ruins. If the enemy's got some really big and incredibly expensive focal units in their army, then literally expending your units to keep them all pinned in their deployment zone for a turn could be well worth it and could potentially be game changing. It's generally best for anything that's going to have slightly lower movement speed or perhaps ground bound and a bit more focused on melee more so than range. Monsters and vehicles going between terrain are a good example. It could be pretty good for slightly slower moving infantry style Death Stars too. If you can have them needing to fight on their own deployment zone turn 1 before they have a chance to move forwards to midfield objectives and things, that could be a really big deal. Otherwise, I did touch on it earlier, but even with slightly lower threat infiltrate type units, you might still be able to do a bit of Alpha Strike style damage dealing. Most infiltrator units don't tend to be enormously high threat in terms of the things that they can bring down, but they might have the right damage profiles to still kill something very valuable in the enemy army. Perhaps things like a squad of 5 pure strain Genestealers for the Genestealer cults are a good example of a unit that could still be really quite threatening despite being fairly cheap. They can move 8 inches and advance and charge as well, so could get a long way into the enemy deployment zone, and potentially if they've got some valuable 1-wound infantry, then just running at them and clawing them all to death before they get a chance to do anything interesting in the game could be a big win. You just need to make sure that what they're doing is actually going to be worth their sacrifice, as usually if you throw Alpha Strikers at the enemy like this, they'll do a bit of damage but not crazy amounts, and then there's a good chance the enemy can just absolutely easily destroy them in short order with close range shooting that's really efficient, or just being able to make really easy charges they wouldn't have had any opportunity to do otherwise. The opponent's just not likely to be expending too much damage output to bring them down, so you need to make sure whatever they actually kill is really worth it. Finally, bear in mind that while infiltrating can have a lot of fun advantages, as talked about, you don't always have to do it with every single infiltration style unit that you have. Maybe the best example might be against slow-moving melee type units that wouldn't be able to get into combat with you otherwise. You definitely don't want to give your opponents the advantage of just being able to make extra long charge moves that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to take. Say, for example, having an infiltrate unit in the midfield could give a unit of orcs a 6-inch move, then a 2d6 charge move, and then perhaps consolidating onto an objective, versus the normal 6-inch move and d6-inch advance that they'd have to do otherwise. Probably means that if you're fighting against such a foe, you'd want your infiltrators so close to the enemy that they're not going to gain any distance by charging them, or you'd want them so far back that they're unlikely to make a successful charge turn 1. Again, the difference between the two could be really quite big in terms of who gets first turn or not. Against slow-moving melee units like that, you could definitely have a great situation if you've gone first and are able to push up to do annoying move block things, or the enemy goes first and they're able to just move and then use your units to boost them into combat and then get them far further up the board. Probably just one to bear in mind, given that things could go very differently and you could have very different experiences game to game depending on who wins first turn. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts and experiences using infiltration style units in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. How many do you tend to use in your army list, and what have been their biggest successes and failures? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas and any other tactics that you have with them. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including new ones just about every day. I do like to keep the regular 40k news reviews and tactics coming. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.